Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. In this episode, we'll be listening for sound and sense. This is the third step of my process of slowly getting to know a poem, the step that follows bean counting, which follows reading aloud. Read the poem aloud, count some beans, time to listen for sound and sense. Before I take a look at the notes I've prepared for the third section of Alfred Lord Tennyson's In Memoriam, and before I then go on to demonstrate how to take notes on sound and sense for one of the other four poems that I'm using for these introductory videos, I wanted to share just a few caveats first. First, I am not an expert in prosody. Prosody is the study of poetry's meter and rhythm. Prosody involves scanning lines and tracking stressed and unstressed patterns. It involves sort of theorizing the structure of different metrical patternings. There are some metrical patterns that are very familiar to people who read just a little bit of poetry. So if you read sonnets or have spent any time studying Shakespeare, you have probably heard of iambic pentameter. But there are lots of other terms wrapped up in prosody and wrapped up in scanning for meter, and I'm not really going to be spending much time doing that at all on this channel. I can't promise I won't, because it's very possible I may go down a rabbit hole one of these weeks or one of these months, and maybe I'll come out the other side being a big prosody fiend. But when I talk about sound and sense, I'm talking about sort of more approachable terms like rhyme, alliteration, caesura, um, uh, onomatopoeia, stuff like that, that most people can tap into if they just listen closely. It doesn't, in other words, require any specialist knowledge or specialist terminology aside from just a handful of words. So that's one caveat. The second is that, how do I put this nicely? I'm not a big fan of people who police other people's pronunciation of words. I think there are a few times and a few social situations in life where it's very appropriate to check someone who's mispronouncing mispronouncing a word. But my sense is it usually involves the mispronunciation of someone's name or the misuse of words that a person would prefer other people use in reference to them. So, for instance, pronouns, nicknames, words like that. But for the most part, I think it's a little elitist and often residually classist, if not other kind of ists, to interrupt people when they're really excited about something to correct their pronunciation. This doesn't mean I've never done it as a professor and as an English teacher, but it does mean that I'm pretty sensitive to the way that the sound of words are sometimes wrapped up with a lot of shame. Um, and sometimes shame really highlights and can catalyze someone's interest in something, but it can also act as an obstacle to one's flourishing and also act as an obstacle to someone choosing to spend more time with the thing that they're initially interested in. So, with that said, it's very possible in the next few minutes and very possible over the next several weeks, if not months, however long I keep this channel going, that I'll be mispronouncing words. So, feel free in the comments to correct my pronunciation. It's not going to bother me much, but but I do just want to point out that the pronunciation of words, while sometimes correct or incorrect, also varies historically, socially, nationally, culturally, and it's not really that cool to think that you're above other people just because you think you pronounce words the right way. So that's what I'll say there. Okay, enough preaching off my soapbox and time to listen. So these are my notes for Alfred Lord Tennyson's In Memoriam. It might seem a little counterintuitive to shift over to making notes about the sound system of a poem after tracking the pronouns of a poem. So as you can see, these are my notes from my previous video on bean counting. And it might seem a bit strange because, as I said in that video, tracking pronouns starts to open up for us as readers the situation or the scene of a poem. So it might feel like one's going backwards when when tasked with trying to develop an account of the sonic dimension of a poem. And yet, I do think there's something worthwhile hitting the pause button on one's initial sense of the situation of the poem and returning to the scene of the initial reading aloud to start to track patterns that one may or may not have noticed that first time through the poem. And so there's a way in which this step actually models the movement of the first two, where we return to the experience of the poem out loud, the audio visual quality of the poem, but we also, by doing that, let our initial sense of the situation brew and cook a little bit before we return and start to give an account of our sense of how the poem develops a situation and scene. All right, so as you can see, I've developed my notes that I shared, I think, in my first welcome video just a little bit. There, I had indicated the rhyme scheme, the traditional rhyme scheme that Tennyson uses and deploys in, I think, every stanza he writes for In Memoriam. This is section 3 of In Memoriam. There is well over 100 sections. That's a lot of stanzas, all of which use this rhyme scheme. But as I was preparing today, I thought it might be useful just to see that what's important about a rhyme scheme is not just the pleasure wrapped up with experiencing the poem out loud, although that is a big piece of why rhyme schemes are important. It's also important because it draws attention and relation between words that might not initially be related. And there might be thematic and conceptual consequences and implications for the words that the poem is bringing together by way of this sonic link and asking us to hold together. This isn't always the case, but in a poem as short as this, I think it is sort of useful to see the words that are related, the end the end words that are related by rhyme sort of put in their relationship here. So you have fellowship, lip, death and breath, sun and run, the other way, sky and cry, stands and hands, tone and own, blind and mind, good and blood. So I probably don't need to go on to describe why it might matter to think about these words in particular, but I think what you may already be anticipating, or at least what I'm anticipating already just looking at this bulleted list, is that tracking the rhymed words is is not an activity that's unrelated to also thinking about the situation or the scene that the poem itself is developing, line to line. One thing I also like to track are patterns of repetition. The particular patterns of repetition that I indicate here, so the triple O of lines 1 through 3, the repetition in lines 11 and 12 of a hollow, a hollow. This is a special kind of repetition called anaphora, which is a term that just refers to the times when a poem or a poet uses the same word or phrase to begin lines that are in sequence with each other. Of course, there are other ways that poets incorporate repetition into their work, but these seemed two instances of repetition worth noting. And of course, alliteration, in addition to rhyme scheme, I might be really any repetition of consonant sounds is what I call alliteration. I know the technical definition of alliteration, at least according to a handout I sometimes use, is just the repetition of speech sound in a sequence of words. Um, and so maybe I'm overgeneralizing it, but that also seems pretty general. So never mind. I'm going to forgive myself and say that what I am describing here is, in fact, alliteration. Now, of course, there are so many patterns of alliteration in this poem. Alliteration is sort of the lifeblood of Tennyson's rhythm and the sort of engine and motor of his verse. So I can't write. I didn't note down every instance of alliteration here. But one thing I do want you to notice is how Tennyson uses alliteration to form phrases in clusters. So, at least in the case of line 3, bitter in a breath, and in lines 4, 5, and 6, what whispers, whispers, web is woven, how he uses the near proximity of these repeated sounds to help give his lines weight, and also to help the reader kind of parse out the different things being said. So those are my notes about sound in Tennyson. And really, in some ways, all I'm doing is again trying to do something that's pretty low stakes, which may not actually feed into my interpretive sense of the poem or my sense of the poem's scene or setting. But like bean counting, tracking the sort of uh, sonic dimension of a poem, just getting on paper or on screen a few observations about the sound system of a lyric poem keeps you in touch with its concrete material and specific existence as a poem. Without these notes, it's very easy to kind of take a step back and just speak in general terms about what you think the poem is about. Insisting on counting lines, counting and tracking punctuation and pronouns, going back through and re-experiencing the audio-visual quality of the poem by tracking phrases that are very pleasing to you for one reason or another, tracking words that are rhymed, tracking other patterns of repetition. Again, this keeps you engaged with the concrete specificity of the poem itself, okay, as it is written and as it can be heard and experienced. Okay, in terms of sense, then, I think I already shared a version of this in a past video, but once I'm pretty satisfied with my notes about the sonic dimension of a poem, I'll just return to the beginning of it and take some notes about how I see the scene or the situation developing either stanza to stanza or section to section. I don't necessarily, again, pressure myself to come up with a deep interpretation of what's going on. I simply start to try to, again, give some body to an account um, of what I think is happening, of what I think is going on, what the concerns of the poem or poet or speaker might be. So again, I because this is a short poem divided into 4 stanzas, it's pretty simple and pretty easy to excuse me, just pretty simple and pretty easy just to work through it in this way. So stanza 1 addresses personified sorrow. Stanzas 2 and 3 record the lies that the speaker requests. Again, remember in line 4, what whispers from thy lying lip, and then we get an immediate quotation. The stars she whispers. So the repetition of whispers there clues us into, oh, we're listening to those whispers and to those lies. And then stanza 4 steps out. The quotation is closed at the end of stanza 3, and the speaker asks another question, which is really, in some sense, a question about what sense we're supposed to make or how we're supposed to move forward, given given what sorrow seems to say, personified sorrow. It might be worth noting that In Memoriam, you can probably tell from its title, is a very long elegy. So the sorrow here is sorrow that is in response to the loss of a beloved person, in this case, a friend, right? A very close friend. And so that's established, of course, both in the title of the whole sequence and in the abbreviation AHH, which are the abbreviated initials of of a friend of Tennyson who died very young. So maybe I'm trespassing a bit on one of the last stages of my process, which has to do with context. But I thought it might just be worthwhile noting this is not just a poem about sorrow that is floating out there unconnected to other threads. But that last question asks doubts, suggests that there is some sort of mental reserves or a rational equipment that the speaker might be able to draw on in order to counteract the lies of sorrow, the passions of sorrow. And so that last question, and I think it's important that it's a question, starts to stage a kind of jostling, an opposition, a dialectic that's coded into and cooked into the experience of grief, where one feels pulled between these poles of reason and passion or feeling, reason and sorrow, the mind and the body, um, truth and lies, lies that sound very true, sweet even. And so that's my initial sense of what the poem is doing. As I sometimes break to students at this stage, if we're talking about a poem at some length and we've made it to about this phase of our discussion, I sometimes tell students that we're still not yet engaged in a sort of deep interpretation of this poem. We're interpreting it to an extent because we're trying to we've sort of unlocked and unpacked a kind of movement of a scene or a situation, of an initial question addressed to the feeling of sorrow, the performance of the putting into words of what sorrow feels like, maybe, or the feeling of loss, what it feels like, and then a loop back into someone responding to that feeling and wondering, is there something in me capable of counteracting this feeling? That's what the poem's doing, right? But that's not necessarily a deep interpretation yet. There are still a lot of things to consider. Um, but if a student had gotten this far talking about the poem, I'd still be very happy and very impressed. So that's listening for sound and sense. Let's take a look at Donica Kelly's Brood. I probably won't write up notes as detailed as my Tennyson notes, but I do think it might be worthwhile just jotting down a few things. And I have thought about this a little bit already, but let me move my face up just a little bit there. Sound and sense. So, of course, in Brood, which I read a couple videos ago out loud, there's no rhyme scheme here. There's really no stanza structure to speak of, but lineation is deeply important. And the absence of punctuation, which I would be tracking if I were bean counting, or noting the absence of if I were bean counting, doesn't mean there aren't still sort of syntactic patterns, sentence patterns that are competing with or working alongside with the decisions Kelly is making with respect to lineation, alignment, the positioning of words and lines on the page. But coming back to sound, if I had already worked through that bean counting stage, I might just kind of note what I sometimes call just sonically pleasing phrases or sonically pleasing moments. So I'm going to sort of type that out, I think. Sonically pleasing phrases. So if I don't immediately have a term to mind, like alliteration or assonance or rhyme, I'll simply just start listing phrases or lines that I just like hearing out loud, right? So the first that comes to mind is, actually, I think I want to bullet these. Still getting used to typing live on this thing, so bear with me. So due to exhume in lines 3 and 4, but earth will do to exhume a heart. Oh gosh. It's if you just kind of extracting that and isolating it, you get a sense of the way sound is still so important to the movement, even though these words are kind of spatially spread out across the web page and the literal printed page. If you have the Kelly's book, The Natural Order of Things, sound is so important for holding it together and still giving it a kind of integrity or texture. Of course, there's the repetition later in the poem, but torpor, um, slowed beat, and it's um, this moment. I think those are lines 9 through 11. Although I'd have to go back through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, 9, 10, 11. Lines 9 through 11 there. There's something that stood out to me just, a few minutes ago as I was preparing to record, um, that there are loads of single syllable words throughout the poem, and this is so important to its rhythm. My chest is earth, all single syllables, monosyllabic, whatever. I meant to write my chest is warm, but earth will do to exhume, and then boom, you hit just a two-syllable word, and it it sort of does something to the rhythm of the poem. And then we go back. A heart beat. I meant to write. Breathe. Did you know I was alive? So just like exhume, alive, right? Paying attention to that. Um, it's almost like a rhyme in a way. Just the pattern of the two-syllable word, right? Exhume, alive, and then we get alive again in the next line, and then we get the 9 through 11 torpor, right, as we go through. Anyway, I'm not going to track all of those, but note, just I'm not talking about rhyme, not talking about alliteration really at the moment, but what I am noticing is how certain repetitions, certain patterns of syllables form a kind of invisible thread that holds again all of these lines together. And then at the end of the poem, I just love this. The thaw and jaw are spread out. And then you have jaw, jaw, y'all. I don't know. There's just something about that. Aground and thaw. I meant spring is coming. I mean, I push the wet dirt with my mandible. I mean, jaw, the jaw, rhyming with thaw, jaw, repeated. Y'all. There, and again, not a perfect echo of a sound, but there's something about it being monosyllabic and also see there's some kind of let's call it sonic intimacy or resonance between jaw and y'all, right, at the same time, that it's as if a voice is kind of waking up. Jaw, jaw, y'all, because it also is then moving into second person address, right, which if we were bean counting would have been part of the stage of tracking pronouns. um Those are lines 25, 23 through 25, I think. Let's count backwards. 23, 22, 21, 20, 19. So that might be 18. Oops, the thaw. All right, so those are sonically pleasing phrases for me. In terms of the situation, um, sense of situation, some of you might be wondering why don't I call this sound and situation? It's because actually, that's a good point. I'm not sure. I think it's because sense is one of these great words that cuts in a couple different ways. Because sense can be both refer both to meaning. What's the meaning of the poem? What's being described? What's the scene or situation being the literal sort of thing happening in the poem? But sense is also connected to the senses and to feeling. And so it seems to me taking notes about the sonic dimension of the poem gets you sort of sensuously interfaced with the poem again, and sort of taps then into that second variant meaning of sense, which is just meaning. And so sense to me is connected to that first term sound, but is then pointing in the direction of what's being described, the meaning, the situation, the scene. I don't know if that makes any sense. Another thing that sometimes happens in my course evaluations is my students, not even complaining, just sometimes note that he often asks us if what he is saying makes any sense. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Which, by the way, is not a good question to ask a entire class, because what are they going to do? Say no? I mean, maybe sometimes they do. All right, so sense of situation. I'm going to try to be brief here because I noticed this is already probably my the longest video I've recorded so far. Um, but I think it's worth noting that the poem from beginning to end moves from to exhume to exhumation. These are lines 4 and 26. So that idea of being dug up or digging oneself out from underground is there early and late in the poem. But also we might wonder about the title, the sense of situation. This is often the phase of when I'm reading a poem or getting to know it that I pause to think about the title of it. Not all poems have titles, like Shakespeare's Sonnet 9 does not have a title. We've numbered it, but it does not have a title. Brood, though. Brood. Is this a noun or a verb? Right? I mean, it matters, right? Is it a noun or a verb? Um, does it name the addressee? Does it name who's being referred to? Is it the y'all? Right? Do you know what I mean? Is it the y'all? Um, or is it um, or does it name the activity of the poem itself? Or both, right? Is the poem itself a brood, right? Or in other words, a brooding? Is this a speaker brooding? Is there something about poets? Is there something about the lyric speakers in general that they are often brooding? There's a great description of the character Stephen Dedalus in James Joyce's Ulysses by uh, a Buck Mulligan, where I think he says to something like to Stephen Dedalus something like, "Give up your moody brooding." Like, and I just love that idea. Mood is another way to think about situation and sense, right? So when I ask what the situation is, I'm also kind of asking what the mood of the poem is. What's its vibe, right? So that's why sense is also the word I prefer over situation. Although what I'm really trying to get to know or give an account of is the situation. Where are we when we start? Where are we when we end? Okay. Another dynamic I see throughout the poem is the um, is a kind of conflict between the written and the spoken, right? Um, or between what is not meant and what is meant. And then there's also parallel to that a kind of contrast between the present and the past. So you'll see one difference between italicized parts of the poem, um, at least early on. My chest is earth, but then right away the speaker says, "I meant to write," and so speaking in past tense, and yet those times can be quite close together. It can be that the speaker is writing, "My chest is earth," and then almost immediately, "I meant to write this." So it's not as if there's a big temporal gap between the the what's been written down and what's being said, but even so, there is a kind of lag, a sort of temporal lag there. I don't know why that matters, but I'm just taking note of it as a component of the situation or the mood being developed here. Um, That temporal lag between the present and the past, the written and the spoken, um, the not meant and the meant, um, present, past, written, spoken, not meant, meant, part of that temporal lag gives the poem a retrospective feel. The speaker is both under and above ground at the same time, is buried, but also already exhumed. And so there's a way in which the poem seems to be about the position of writing and saying something, maybe after a period of dormancy. And that sense of temporal lag, of dormancy, connects after some thought to words that stand out throughout. So exhume, of course, torpor, dearth, um, mandible. There are words that are initially difficult to integrate into my growing sense of the situation, and sort of cards on the table. Uh, my sense of the situation I didn't really understand at all until much later in my process of getting to know the poem, where I realized there was a whole thing happening here with respect to a governing metaphor of cicadas, which live underground for over a decade before digging themselves up and having the sort of short life above ground. Um, and so my analysis of that metaphor, um, would wait for the later or the next step in my close reading process, my process of slowly getting to know the poem. But I hope what you see is that me sort of trying to step through and understand what the poem is up to and the situation that it's developing from the beginning to the end with respect to a sense of the speaker being underground, a sense of sort of retrospective reflection over the written, over the use of speech, over a kind of gap between what is meant and not meant, a gap between the past and the present. This eventually leads me to start wondering about what to make of some of these other terms, which would, if I had been a savvier reader, had made me think, oh, maybe there is a connection to insect life happening here that I'm completely missing. What lives underground for a long time before digging itself up? Cicadas. That's what's going on here. Okay. Um, and so there's a sense of an analogy, of a comparison happening between a cicada digging itself out of the ground, um, and the sense of a poet or poetry waking up, coming to light after a period of darkness, saying and writing and voicing as a digging oneself up out of the ground. This brought to mind a famous poem by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney called Digging, which I may look at in a future video. a little unfair because another poem I know well, and in future videos, I'd like to look at poems that I don't know well, and that I'll be sort of getting to know with all of you as I work through these steps. Um, uh, but every so often, it'll be fun to look at a poem I don't know. All right. Well, we're at 35 minutes. That seems plenty of time to have gone over um, sound and sense. So I will post this only to me. Let's take a look at those notes. So, not a lot written there, but I hope this has been useful as a way to think about the next phase of getting to know a poem. We've gone over reading aloud, we've gone over bean counting, and now we've listened for sound and sense. We'll see what's up next. Something to do with form and figure, I believe. All right. Well, thanks for reading poems with me today, and I hope to see you tomorrow.